Good morning. I'm Ivo Daalder of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and this is World Review, our weekly review of the world's news with journalists from around the world. Today, we're joined by Karen DeYoung, Associate Editor and Senior National Security Correspondent from the Washington Post. Karen, wonderful to have you back.
Thanks, good to be here.
Steve Erlanger, who is Chief Diplomatic Correspondent in Europe for the New York Times, is joining us from Brussels. Steve, wonderful to have you back.
Thank you, Ivo, for the invitation.
And Susan Glasser, staff writer at the New Yorker, joining us from Washington, D.C. Susan, great to have you.
Oh, I'm delighted to be here. Thank you so much, Ivo.
Well, the world keeps on churning, so lots of things to talk about. Let's start with what is still on the front pages of every newspaper all around the world, the situation with regard to COVID, and particularly in the United States, but also in other parts of the world. The bifurcation, Karen, between what's happening in Europe and the developing world and in the United States in terms of the spread of disease is really remarkable. And so we have to think about what are the consequences for everything that we do.
Well, I think the first thing you have to talk about, I don't know what that was. First thing, are being broken on every level in this country. You've got 3.5 million cases in the United States, by far the most in the world. Yesterday, they set another record, 75,000 new cases. The number of new cases per day has more than doubled over the past 3 weeks. 135,000 people dead. And I think that now there's little question that we probably reach the 200,000 that Dr. Fauci predicted a couple of weeks ago that the administration kind of dismissed as ludicrous. You've got 10 states now every day setting new records for numbers of cases and deaths. At the same time, you've got a lot of these states and states all around the country mandating masks be worn everywhere in public, closing down, many states closing down things that they had reopened a month or weeks ago. In, I think, almost every case reopened in violation of what were CDC guidelines of plateauing and a flat line in the number of cases for 14 days. Really nobody reach that milestone. Now you have the Georgia Governor Brian Kemp going in the other direction, saying that cities there are no longer allowed to mandate people wearing masks. He and the city of Atlanta are suing each other, so it's a big mess. So when you compare that to what's happening around the world, again, the United States is far and above any other country. Brazil is in second place with 2 million cases, and now the president, Bolsonaro, saying that he's been infected, even as he removed his mask to talk to reporters to tell them that he was infected. India, number 3, has just broken the 1 million cases level and is expected to get as high as Brazil in the near future. So you contrast that with what's happening primarily in Europe, where lockdowns were pretty extreme. Mask wearing was mandated fairly early on in most cases, and they're actually doing pretty well. You've got low levels of new cases, low levels of death, almost across the board, not everywhere, but really almost across the board, from taking these early tough measures. Kids are in schools or about to start school, and you see, in particular in Germany, you see Angela Merkel, who at the beginning of this year was kind of nowhere in terms of her popularity and seemed really the kind of ultimate lame duck, is now, I think the most recent poll showed her popularity at 86% in Germany, which seemed pretty astounding. Compare that to Washington Post poll that came out just this morning, where we had, again, the highest figures, 60% disapprove of the way the president has handled the virus, with only 38% approving. And most of those who disapprove strongly. So I think you can make these comparisons, and they're almost completely on the basis of which countries had a national policy, implemented it early on, stuck to it, and did not back off of it until they reached the milestones that they'd set.
Steve, of course, you're living in Europe, you're living in Belgium, which had a really very bad hit, particularly in terms of older people dying early on, but the situation is stabilizing there, and people are thinking, not only thinking, but going on vacation. And I think today, for the first time, European leaders are meeting. We'll talk about what they're talking about in a minute, but they're meeting in person.
Well, they are, and they're kind of greeting each other with bumps and grinds maybe later when they get down to substance. But what basically Europe has moved into a whole different stage, which is looking for local outbreaks and then cracking down again in certain cities or regions or even neighborhoods. It just seems like America has lost even the possibility of that kind of contact tracing. And this is what really worries people, because, you know, the big lockdown in Europe, which, you know, wasn't the same everywhere, but it lasted long enough for much of the spread to die out and the R factor to get well below 1. And as you say, most of the, well, certainly in Belgium and France, 45% of the deaths were in nursing homes or care homes. True in Britain as well, partly because people didn't realize at the very beginning that the virus could pass from people who had no symptoms. So that there was a lot of unintentional spread early on, particularly as people were transferred from nursing homes to hospitals, vice versa. So it is very, very different. I mean, there's still anxiety about a second wave. People are paying a great deal of attention, but it is true. Many, many people are wearing masks. Mask wearing is obligatory on public transport. It's obligatory inside shops. You know, restaurants are being very, very careful. But life is beginning to return to a very wary, I wouldn't say a normal, but you know, you can go about, you can travel, but even on a train, you know, subway, bus, wear a mask, wash your hands, the whole thing. But the sense of real fear isn't there right now.
Susan, of course, not only in Europe, but also in East Asia, you see the same lessons have now been learned, in the sense that if you can bend that curve, an old word that we have forgotten about, an old phrase, then you can actually deal with the outbreaks in an individual way. In Melbourne, they're doing it. In Australia, in Hong Kong, they're increasing some significant lockdowns in order to snuff it out beforehand. These are the lessons that we now all know, and somehow in our political system, that is not part and parcel anymore of our conversation. This isn't rocket science in some ways when you think about how to deal with it, given the experience we see around the world. And yet it's not really working here in the United States.
Well, you're right, it's not working at all. This is unfortunately not what most of us thought we meant by American exceptionalism. And yet, nonetheless, this is a version of American exceptionalism that makes us stand out in the world for all the wrong reasons. And that, you know, 3 quick observations that flow from that. Number one, however we emerge from this, I think it's clear already, putting aside whatever happens this fall, and there are grave and increasingly dire warnings from America's public health experts about what to expect this fall. But putting that aside, I think it's already clear that you are looking at a situation that has been a terrible blow to American soft power and standing in the world. I think even for those who continue to look to the United States as a beacon, if a troubled one, for democracy. This is just such an embarrassment. It's a national humiliation. And I do think that the damage from that is likely to be lasting, non-obvious in certain ways, and a factor in how the U.S. emerges in the world after this, number one. Number two, there is a shift in the political geography of the pandemic here in the United States, and watching the politics of that play out. One of the ways in which we have been exceptional, and not in a good way in the world, is the instant partisanization and politicization of basic public health precautions such as mask wearing. Really nowhere else in the world, including places that have been challenged by the epidemic, have you seen it so identified with one political party or the other. And of course, that was a conscious strategy on the part of President Trump. It seems to be rejected by Americans when you look at the polling numbers that Karen cited. On the one hand, at the same time, coverage of this persistent, maybe a small minority, but it's received outsized attention. And so now you have a situation where Republicans are essentially turning on each other, and you have the small faction of extremist leaders, such as the governor of Georgia that Karen mentioned, who have literally gone to court in order to stop the mayor of Atlanta from allowing her to put in place a public safety measure. On the one hand, right next door in Alabama, an equally conservative right-wing Republican governor who put in effect a statewide masking order. You now have many of the largest companies in the United States doing this. It's very belated. This is the kind of thing that should have happened in March. And let's be real, this is what failure looks like, folks. So what's going to happen as this political geography continues to morph? And then, I think the third factor that's relevant in terms of international politics in the United States is, what are the advantages that you are already going to see as a result of America's leadership being distracted, incapable of handling this. And the economic shoe that's about to drop is the expiration of our emergency measures and a gridlocked political system here in Washington that so far has not come up with a new plan for how to provide aid to struggling American businesses as the existing aid is about to run out. So that's the third thing I would really spotlight for people. The economic aspect of this is about to get worse in the United States and not better very, very soon.
Karen, Susan talked about the American exceptionalism, and not in the way we usually talk about it, but the other way we do usually talk about is human rights, and the idea that in American foreign policy, the promotion of human rights and making sure that the rest of the world lives up to human rights is important. Secretary Pompeo yesterday gave a big speech in Philadelphia on the receipt of a report that he had asked from the Commission on Unalienable Rights. What are we to take that speech, and what does it mean for foreign policy and our human rights policy?
Well, this was an initiative of Secretary Pompeo's about a year ago, where he appointed this Commission on Unalienable Rights, saying that America had gone astray in trying to declare all kinds of things that were really political and societal questions as human rights that ought to be guaranteed by the government. He appointed, I think, 11 people, some of them, most of them pretty conservative, some of them academics, some theologians, and tasked them with coming up with a report within a year, which they have now done. In the meantime, he's given a sort of series of speeches of his definition of unalienable rights, which he says are couched in the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and do not include things like reproductive rights, like sexual orientation rights. And a lot of people have said this is basically sort of a political ploy of the administration to marginalize people and to actually remove rights from people. I think the report itself is kind of anodyne. I mean, it has long sections where they say, let us remind you of the Declaration of Independence and how it got written, and this is what it says, and here's what the Constitution says, and here is what the United Nations has done, and the history of the UN Declaration of Human Rights. And then it's kind of a one hand or the other. You know, some people say that these are the only rights that everybody can agree on, therefore they are the unalienable rights. Some people say that the United States only cracks down on other countries that it says are violating rights when they're not their friends or their allies, which is pretty much true. But then goes on to sort of define countries that have reached the kind of zenith of human rights recognition, a class in which it puts the United States. Others are progressing, and we shouldn't be so hard on them. And others, not surprisingly, China, Russia, are pretty much off the charts in terms of not recognizing rights. They come down very hard on recognition of property rights and religious rights. And Pompeo, in this speech introducing this report yesterday, really limited himself to those questions. He said that because there are attacks on property rights, and because there are attacks, he said, on religious rights, he says the founding principles of America are under attack. This is because the mainstream news media continues to publish fake and non-objective news. Protesters have torn down statues that are part of the American way of life. And all of these are antithetical to US ideals. It was basically a political speech, which touched on all the themes that the president and the official Republican Party have touched on, that we need to protect these basic rights, and that other things are a matter of voting, of politics, and that when people go out in the streets to assert their right of assembly and to protest, that in fact is antithetical to the American way of life. And in fact, he even compared it to Marxist ideology and said that that's what's going on. So it was basically a sort of political statement. Lots of criticism from people you would expect to criticize. Some support from people you would expect to report it, but I don't see this, and haven't seen it since when he first announced it. It's basically a sort of semantic political exercise that I don't think will have a lot of influence, except once again, as Susan said, on America's kind of standing in the world, and America, which sees itself, and many others have traditionally seen it, as standing up for rights.
Susan, it strikes me that as we are in the middle of the big debate in the United States with regard to our history, with regard to racism, with regard to inequality, as Karen said, we're moving the administration, and now its chief foreign policy diplomat is moving into this conversation with a particular political point of view. How do you think that plays among our friends, but also our enemies? How are the Chinese going to take this? How are the Russians looking at this? Do they see an alignment between the Pompeo's view and their own view, or how is this going to work out for them?
Well, it's a good question. I would highlight a couple things. First of all, Karen's given a good summation of how political this is, and remember that Mike Pompeo in many ways is probably the most political and partisan Secretary of State potentially that we've ever had, certainly in modern times. And when I spent like 6 months last year looking at him as secretary, that was the thing that leapt out. He was essentially an obscure backbencher House member from a very solidly Republican conservative district in Kansas, who sort of came from nowhere in politics to become Secretary of State in the course of 10 years in which the lesson learned was to, ride, in his case, the politics of Benghazi and sort of an inflammatory made for television, made for Fox News scandal into the job of America's chief diplomat. So I think it reflects an approach that is highly optical, that is very much consistent with that of the White House and what they want to see. It seems like an election year statement of the culture war. It was odd, right? Actually, at first, the first I saw of it was not this, as Karen said, anodyne report put out from the State Department, but the clip of the Secretary of State attacking a one-year-old New York Times history project called the 1619 Project. What is that about? That was very odd, to get in an argument with a one-year-old piece of historical newspaper journalism about what role the importation of slaves and the slave economy played in the founding of the United States, strikes me as probably not the most urgent geopolitical or diplomatic priority at this moment of global economic and health crisis, right? So that's number one, is this sort of, I think any analyst, certainly in Russia and China and anywhere, would look at that and say that this is a moment in the United States when its chief diplomat is distracted by internal domestic politics, focused inwardly, and part of the culture war. So that's one takeaway. And then the other thing I would just spotlight is I've been trying to think lately, what are going to be the longer term impacts or lasting effects of the Trump administration, whether it lasts 4 more years or not, we don't know, but what is a lasting impact from the first term of Donald Trump? And I do think that it's going to be very hard to undo some of the damage to the United States as a beacon of democracy, small d, and independence and freedom in the world. The question of American hypocrisy has always loomed large for decades in international debates over foreign policy and the role of the US in the world. This was a staple of Soviet rhetoric, after all. When we criticized the Soviet Union, the Soviets would talk about, the American civil rights movement and the terrible treatment of African Americans in the United States. So it's not that this is new, but I do think that you're seeing sort of a last gasp of this rhetoric of the politics of a West, capital W, that may or may not exist anymore, and therefore how hard it will be to see American efforts at democracy promotion, at promotion of things like America's approach to inalienable rights. Unfortunately, it's now seen through a partisan political prism in a way that undercuts the notion that there is one American foreign policy that is broadly supported by both Democrats and Republicans. And I think you now understand pretty clearly, if you're in Moscow or Beijing, that that's not the case.
So, Steve, this of course played out in your part of the world, in Poland in particular, where democracy and rule of law were part of the issues on the agenda.
Well, it did, but let me say first, it will be seen as a purely domestic political speech that Pompeo made. It also contradicts what Trump came into office saying, which is that the world can do whatever it wants, that we're not going to tell the world what to believe, right? I mean, my favorite quote from Trump, I think it was 2017, when he was asked about Putin, he said, well, we're killers too, right? That's the Trump point of view. So it's very, very odd to start preaching to the rest of the world, which isn't really listening, much as Susan said, about inalienable rights. And if they're inalienable, then no one can deal with them anyway. There they are. And really, it's 4 months to go in a very bitter campaign, and this is part of it. And you're absolutely right. I think Trump is taking some of his campaign from the culture wars we see in Europe between elites and the countryside, between Brussels and its belief in gender equality and religious freedom and individual rights, and countries who are very worried or playing on these issues of identity, what it is to be a Pole or a Hungarian or an American, right? And in Poland, you just had a very divided election for a presidency, which actually matters because it has big veto power, between someone who really was a part of the ruling party, which is the Law and Justice Party, which has its strength in the countryside, and has been in a very tight battle with the more liberal Poles who are in the big cities. And so the current president, Andrzej Duda, just won a narrow, but I think won it legitimately, victory against the mayor of Warsaw, someone the same exact age named Trzaskowski, who represented this more European-looking elite, right? This European-looking, liberal-looking, you know, we should join the modern world. It's not threatening, but Duda ran a campaign that had anti-Semitic tropes, that had anti-lesbian and gay tropes, that tried to frighten Poles into thinking that their Polishness, the Holy Catholic Church of Poland that creates everyone's identity there, is at risk. And you see the parallels with what President Trump's trying to do with his own base, which is to say, we're the real Americans, we're the people who will protect you from all these people who are destroying our history, our inalienable rights, et cetera. So I think it really is fascinating. I mean, because I think Trump in trouble is looking to Europe for campaign themes, and he's finding them.
Karen, Trump, of course, embraced Duda. He had him to the White House a few weeks ago and made very clear who he wanted to win. And I don't think he's yet tweeted about the fact that his endorsement might have led to Duda's victory, but he will clearly see this as a positive for both his view of how to run a campaign at home, but also how to conduct foreign policy abroad and who his friends are in Europe and around the world.
Well, I think not only did President Trump believe that he could put Duda over the line, Duda believed that President Trump could put him over the line. He was here 4 days before the second round of the elections. He made his pitch once again for more U.S. troops in Poland. He said, don't take them out of Germany to send them to Poland, just send more troops to Poland. But I think the message was pretty clear. Germany, bad, we don't like them. Poland, good, we do like them. They spend a lot on defense. And so what we're waiting for is to see what the payoff for that is going to be. Trump said last week that, yes, we are going to withdraw up to 10,000 troops from Poland. Half of them are going to come home, he said. Half of them are going to stay. Half of those who are going to stay somewhere, he didn't say where, are going to go to Poland. The rest are going to go somewhere else. I think that the likelihood of this actually happening before the election is probably pretty slim, but he's made his views pretty clear that this is the way he wants to move the U.S. posture in Europe.
Susan, we're closer on time. On to the next big issue that has befallen us here in the last week, of course, which is a continuing escalation of tensions between the United States and China, with, of course, the Chinese taking very serious and strong actions in Hong Kong after the enactment of the new national security law, and the United States in a whole series of speeches and statements really ratcheting up the pressure in a way that is not designed to get to a common position on anything, but really to put two sides on the opposing sides. What's happened this week, and where do you think this is leading to?
Well, thanks, Ivo. I do think this has, really been a focus, and in some ways has not gotten the attention that it would get at any other moment, given not only the coronavirus pandemic, but President Trump's own sort of public meltdown. That's made it harder to focus on what I think has been a very coordinated and very loud effort on the part of essentially Trump's cabinet, not really aided so much by him, to come out with a series of different attacks on the Chinese, so that you have a major speech yesterday by the Attorney General William Barr, in which he actually criticized American companies for enabling and facilitating, especially technology companies, the Chinese. You have Secretary Pompeo is about to make another major speech. There are reported considerations that the United States wants to ban all 94 million members of the Chinese Communist Party from being allowed to travel to the United States. And, interestingly enough, the reports are that it was President Trump who was not yet willing to go along with this. And that's one thing that I would like to spotlight here, which is this is kind of an example, and it's often been the case over the last 3.5 years of the Trump administration, where you have a Trump administration foreign policy that is not entirely supported by the president himself. And that leads to a lot of tensions. It leads to things like what appears to be a coordinated policy rollout and yet a conflicting message from the Oval Office. And so I think some of that is still going on here. From the very beginning of the Trump presidency, you've had this very tough on China rhetoric and arguably political shift in both parties of recognition that the previous policy of engagement and integrating China in the world system had not really succeeded and had allowed both the national security threat of rising Chinese power unchecked, and also economically it was not proving beneficial to the United States or its partners. So, you have on the one hand this bipartisan move for more confrontation with China, which again was symbolized in the passage of a measure on Capitol Hill, censuring the Chinese in effect for this move in Hong Kong and revision of a status quo that the United States and other Western leaders took seriously. And President Trump signed that, and yet his Oval Office press conference the other day, which was essentially like a 1-hour run-on sentence campaign for re-election, in which he actually called Joe Biden an agent of the Chinese Communist Party, which I think is probably not a campaign theme that anyone thinks is really seriously going to stick on Joe Biden, but it's interesting. So you had essentially the domestic politics version of China policy from President Trump, which is Democrats, China bad. And then you, at the same time, have this much more complicated, nuanced version of China policy from the president's cabinet, from Mike Pompeo, from Bill Barr, from even the FBI director, Chris Wray, who gave, I think, a little notice but significant remarks about the extent to which, I think he said that they are now opening investigations of a Chinese related counterintelligence or, investigation, something like, more than once an hour right now at the FBI. And of course, you have Mike Pompeo, who has often styled his tenure at the State Department as himself as the Uber hawk. He has been one of the few voices who has consistently talked about the terrible human rights violations of corralling more than 1 million Chinese Muslims, Uyghurs, into modern day versions of concentration camps. And yet, because the President of the United States consistently downplays human rights issues and has consistently tried to portray himself as having a very close relationship with Xi Jinping. He's praised him repeatedly as a strong leader. When there were enormous democracy protests in Hong Kong earlier, he essentially said, my man Xi Jinping has got this covered, no problem here. He's really going to take care of it well. Even early on in the coronavirus, which President Trump now calls the China virus and the Wuhan virus, at the beginning of the pandemic, he actually praised Xi for his response to it. And so these very contradictory messages tend to undercut what has been a fairly unified and hardline presentation from the administration itself.
Karen, this hardline policy that, as Susan said, is at times contradicted by the President of the United States, but this hardline policy really seems to becoming very, very hardline, in which there is no room for dialogue, no room for trying to get stuff done together. It's all about painting a picture of a Chinese Communist Party that is out to dominate the world, and we are the last bastions left. Even in the Cold War, by the 1960s, we weren't pursuing those kinds of unnuanced policies. And yet that seems not only to, as Susan said, the trend in the Trump administration, but frankly, among Democrats on the Hill as well, sort of a black wall of opposition and finding ways not to deal with each other. How effective is that going to be?
Well, I'm always struck when Secretary Pompeo, as Susan said, he speaks about China at every opportunity. He not only gives regular speeches, whenever he gives interviews, which are mostly with conservative outlets, that's what he wants to talk about. And he never just says China, he always says the Chinese Communist Party. And in some ways, it's the new Cold War. I mean, some of the language is Cold War language, but as you pointed out, it's almost worse, because at least during the Cold War, there was always a recognition by most politicians, at least, and most government leaders, that you had to maintain a dialogue, that there were certain things that you needed to discuss. And I think that the way in which this is being presented does not leave that opening. Basically says there's no point in talking to these people because they have cheated us, they have ripped us off, as the president keeps saying. They are even now trying to undermine us. They sent us this virus. I mean, the president actually said this week that implied that this was a policy move by China to infiltrate infected people into this country in order to spread the virus in the United States. China has never been very popular on Capitol Hill with either party. I think that on a trade level, there is a sense that they've been stealing intellectual property for a long time, that administrations have not been too tough on it. Granted, they have been pressured a lot by American business not to be too tough on China, because American companies have been making a whole lot of money in China. So I think that there's no break wall for this. There's nothing really to stop it at this point. There's no political break at the moment. There's no economic break at the moment. And so I think it will go on for a while. Again, as so many things, depends on what happens in the election.
Well, and Steve, of course, this really creates a fundamental problem for our European friends, as we saw again playing out this week, where a more subtle form of engagement is still desirable by many Europeans, certainly by Mrs. Merkel, who still hopes to have a summit between the EU and China. And of course, the UK government had to make a big decision and announced a big decision on Huawei and 5G, just demonstrating how this competition is shaping even politics in Europe.
It is very much so. And Europe does not want to get caught in a two-polar world between Beijing and Washington. Europe looks at the rise of China as inevitable. It's not going to be stopped. It can be engaged. People still believe it needs to be engaged. People believe we need China on issues of climate change, of migration, of aid to Africa, that you cannot decouple yourself from a rising China. It's too big, it's too important. People are, as Karen rightly said, waiting for the election, because even if, Joe Biden politically has to be very strong against China, and I suppose he is, but he knows Xi Jinping quite well. And the tone of a Biden relationship with China, one suspects, would be different, not so not quite so confrontational. And it would be one where the Europeans would be much more willing to talk to a Biden administration about a joint policy toward China, maybe rejoin some form of TTP trade pact, to pull China in on issues of carbon capture and technology. But I mean, Germany by itself does, you know, €1 billion a day of trade with China. And it's like Russia too. I mean, it's right next door. Europe is not going to get dragged into some Cold War. I mean, it's going to be skeptical about China. It won't be equidistant between Washington and Beijing, but it's not going to jump into Washington's lap on this issue, nor should it.
Karen, another of these consequences where the competition is playing out is in Iran, where the Iranians and the Chinese have concluded a major new strategic partnership, both economic and military, that seems to move the Iranians into the Chinese orbit, or put it the other way around, China closer into the Iranian orbit and into the Persian Gulf. And when you think about strategic competition, having the Chinese and the U.S. competing in the Gulf is a new strategic situation.
Well, I would file this under the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And China needs oil. Iran has oil. It can't sell it without great difficulty anywhere because of U.S. sanctions. And China's not scared. So I think that this is a deal that actually the New York Times broke the story. It's a very good story that this is a at this point, as far as we know, a sort of final draft economic and security relationship with China investing hundreds of billions of dollars in Iran, and Iran having a place to sell its oil, and desperately needing money and needing infrastructure investment. China wants oil. China also wants to expand its Belt and Road system around the world, and has had some setbacks on that, certainly in Asia. And I think China sees this as a no-lose situation. Also puts a finger in the eye of the United States, as you mentioned. But this has been approved by the Iranian government, has not been approved by the Iranian parliament, and there is some opposition to it in Iran. I mean, China is not known as a country being particularly friendly to Muslims. They've got 1 million Uyghur Muslims in concentration camps. I think that Iran does not want to, in general, as a historical issue, make itself beholden to China any more than it wants to return to a position where it was beholden to the United States, however many decades ago. It's not clear whether President Xi has signed off on this on China, but there's no question that it's quite well advanced, and it makes sense from their point of view. And the question will be, what can the United States do about it? What will it do about it? They're already in a quandary about what to do about the sanctions against Iranian arms purchases and sales that are about to go away in October. The Americans are trying to get the Europeans to agree with them that these sanctions have to be reimposed. They were lifted as part of the Iran nuclear deal. Russia has said, well, you're not in the Iran nuclear deal anymore. China has said it too. You don't have any say over this. The Europeans are kind of stuck in the middle. But I think that U.S. influence and U.S. ability to avoid these kind of things that are seen as inimical to U.S. interest is limited at this point.
About 1 minute left. The other thing, of course, that's happening with Iran, Susan, is that there's a lot of fires and explosions going on all over the country, apparently, and some suggestion that a significant setback in the nuclear program might have been manufactured by Israel, perhaps even with our help or not.
Well, that's right, Ivo. This is obviously would not be unprecedented. It's the kind of action we've seen from Israel before. It views the Iranian nuclear program as an existential threat, has been a key architect in many ways of working with the Trump administration and Republicans in Congress to undermine and to get America out of the Iran nuclear deal, and in a way leaving the field open to attack. I'll just leave you with this final note, really striking piece from the very low profile national security advisor right now, the White House, wrote the other day, in which he observed that Iran has closer than ever before to obtaining nuclear weapons, which seemed like a sort of unintended admission that they had failed in their stated policy of countering an Iran nuclear program, and that the withdrawal from the nuclear deal that the United States undertook has not successfully been replaced or succeeded by a new diplomatic initiative. Karen talked about what the administration is trying to do, but let's be honest here. The Europeans aren't going to agree to that, never mind the Russians and the Chinese, where everyone's just going to wait and see what the election has to bear in the United States. But basically, diplomacy by the Trump administration has failed or been non-existent with regards to Iran. They have isolated them. They have increased the pressure on them economically. And now this appears to be an instance in which there is now military action being taken. I think those reports are probably reliable. And it suggests the direction of further conflict this might go if the United States does remain out of the deal and Trump is reelected for another term. I think you'd see more of this kind of confrontation occurring.
Susan Glasser, Karen DeYoung, Steve Erlanger, wonderful to have you joining for World Review this week. We'll be back next week. And in the meantime, I wish you all a very good weekend.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.